Hey guys, tonight we're slipping off our sandals and stepping into the quiet back streets of Edo period Japan, where the scent of wood smoke drifts lazily through narrow alleyways, and someone, somewhere, is definitely baking bread. Which is odd, because this is 17th century Japan, and bread isn't exactly a thing yet. You brush past a lacquered doorway, hear the squish of Geta sandals on the damp cobblestones, and your nostrils twitch at something yeasty, warm, and slightly burnt. This is not the fragrance of grilled fish or miso soup. No, this smells like crust, and rebellion. You turn a corner and spot it. A thin curl of steam rising from a slatted wooden house tucked behind a sake shop. There's a soft clattering inside. You listen close. Someone's whisking. Flour puffs out of a cracked open window. And then comes the unmistakable sound of a katana clinking against a mixing bowl. You're not supposed to hear that, and frankly, you're not supposed to be here. Because this is the hidden bakery of a samurai named Takeda Mitsunari, a man who wore silk-lined armor by day and kneaded dough by candlelight when no one was looking. You probably won't survive this. Not because of danger, there are no assassins behind the curtain, no secret police at the gate, but because it's 4 a.m., there's a warm roll with your name on it, and you're dangerously close to curling up on a rice mat and falling asleep forever. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly into the alley, your feet brushing against errant grains of rice and discarded chopsticks. The mist from the river hasn't quite burned off yet, and the sun is just a hint behind Mount Fuji's silhouette. The wooden slats of the house ahead are weathered but sturdy, and from inside comes the unmistakable scent of cinnamon? The house once belonged to a minor official in the local daimyo's court, until a rather peculiar samurai moved in. That samurai, Takeda Mitsunari, was known for 3 things: his silence in council meetings, his inexplicably soft hands, and the way his armor always smelled faintly of toast. You slide open the door and step inside. Tatami mats, a bonsai tree in the corner. And there, crouched beside a clay oven with smoke rising like incense, is Takeda. He's wearing a faded kimono, the color of old eggplant, and he's very delicately brushing egg wash onto a tray of perfectly shaped rolls. Not rice balls, not mochi. Actual rolls. This is a man who once served as a footman during the Shimabara Rebellion, who learned to read Confucian war strategy manuals in 4 languages. And now, instead of writing haiku about the brevity of life, he is staring intently at the proofing of dough. Here's your first reality check of the night. Baking was not part of the Bushido code. A samurai was expected to be many things: stoic, literate, deadly with a blade, but absolutely not a part-time baker. Especially not one who used foreign methods. Historians still argue whether Takeda ever formally broke rank with his clan. Some say he simply retired early after the death of his elder brother. Others suggest he was quietly dismissed for failing to execute a rebellious merchant, who, rumor had it, once gifted him a cinnamon loaf. But here he is. The sword still rests on a lacquered rack in the corner, glinting faintly in the morning light. But now it's flanked by measuring cups carved from bamboo and a small bowl filled with something that smells suspiciously like nutmeg. The blade, sharp and quiet, watches over a different battlefield now, the kitchen. You watch as Takeda adjusts the fire under the oven, his hands moving with the same precision you imagine he once used to draw a blade. The dough rises obediently under a cloth warmed by the embers. Somewhere in the house a rooster crows and he pauses. Not to bow, not to pray, but to sniff the air and nod in satisfaction. A normal samurai might spend this hour polishing armor or practicing kata. Takeda, on the other hand, is consulting a handwritten scroll titled Rising Times and Sweet Outcomes. You glance at a margin note written in delicate calligraphy: "Knead with honor, but do not overdo it." Later historians would be baffled by this scroll when it was discovered in the ashes of the original bakery. Some even speculated it was satire, but others noticed the smudges of flour still trapped in the creases and began to take it more seriously. In the corner of the scroll is a sketch of a European-looking loaf labeled cloud bread in kanji. No one's entirely sure where he saw it. Some say he tasted it during an assignment in Nagasaki, where Portuguese traders first introduced wheat flour and cast iron pans to Japan. Others claim it came to him in a dream. Whatever the source, you're now standing in the origin point of a minor culinary rebellion. No shogunate decree covers this. No official record describes it. But as the first loaf hits the oven and the air turns thick with the scent of browning crust, you realize you've entered a moment that sits quietly at the edge of history. Half fact, half fiction, all freshly baked. You blink slowly, adjusting to the flickering light of the oven, and take a moment to let the warmth sink in. It's the kind of slow, wood-fired heat that makes your knees feel heavy and your eyelids droop. Across the kitchen, Takeda Mitsunari continues his silent ballet, kneading dough with both deliberation and a surprising gentleness for someone who once trained in the deadly art of iaijutsu, the rapid unsheathing of a sword. You edge a little closer, and now you can see it. On a small wooden shelf, tucked between jars of pickled plums and dried persimmons, rests a faded lacquer box. It looks like it might contain ceremonial incense, or perhaps old correspondence, but no. Inside are measuring spoons worn smooth from years of use, and in a small cloth pouch beside them, yeast. Alive, bubbling, and very much not a part of any samurai handbook. Takeda wasn't born with an apron around his waist. He came from a long line of retainers who had served the same daimyo family for 3 generations. His father died honorably during a border skirmish involving horses, a lightning storm, and one tragically misplaced spear. Young Takeda was expected to follow suit, though ideally with fewer horse-related mishaps. He trained as all young samurai did, by learning to read classical Chinese, shooting arrows at straw targets, and memorizing the various ways to politely behead someone. He was good, quiet, diligent, the kind of boy who always bowed slightly too long, the kind of man who never spilled tea. But something shifted the day he was sent to guard a foreign monk. The monk, a retired Portuguese missionary with thinning eyebrows and a suspiciously large number of bags, had been granted safe passage through Edo on his way to Nagasaki. Takeda was assigned to escort him, largely because no one else wanted to listen to sermons about bread. It started as a chore. The monk rambled about the body of Christ and the crust of life, and carried with him a strange, musky-smelling ball of fermented dough wrapped in oilcloth. He called it Gerald. Gerald, it turned out, was a sourdough starter, brought from Lisbon to Macau, and then smuggled into Japan in what historians now believe may have been a repurposed rosary case. The monk swore it was over 80 years old. Takeda, who had never owned anything more foreign than sesame candy, was skeptical. He watched, arms crossed, as the monk constructed a makeshift oven, using hot stones, an upturned brazier, and what may have been a shrine roof tile. When the bread finally came out, crackling, golden, steaming, it was like nothing Takeda had ever known. It was soft inside. It had structure, and it smelled like everything his samurai upbringing had quietly forbidden: comfort, curiosity, and carbohydrates. He didn't speak for a long time after that first bite. Historians still argue whether this was the precise moment Takeda's career began to pivot. Some scholars maintain that he had already been dabbling in rice flour confections. Others claim that Gerald changed everything, that the sour tang of that first bite rewired something deep within his warrior's soul. Either way, after the monk departed, Gerald stayed behind. Takeda kept him alive, feeding him carefully in a small porcelain bowl that had once belonged to his grandmother. Every night, while the other retainers sharpened swords and composed poems about cherry blossoms, he studied the art of fermentation, and studied it hard. You wouldn't know it from the quiet man with the sleepy eyes now brushing egg wash across a poppy seed roll. But this was once a man who charted yeast behavior like a military strategist. He documented rise times with brush and ink. He plotted optimal dough hydration with the precision of a battlefield diagram. There's a scroll on his desk from this period, titled On the Swelling of Wheat. It includes such philosophical gems as to rise is to resist collapse, and the oven's flame is both destroyer and creator. Modern food historians quote these lines semi-ironically at conferences. And then there's the poetry. because of course he wrote poetry. Takeda's haiku from this period include, "Still as a koi pond, yeast blooms beneath wooden lid, battle waits for bread," and "Rice laughs in the field I kneel before foreign grain, cloud soft, crust, forgive." He began waking earlier than the others, slipping out before morning drills to tend to his starter and warm the oven. The sword remained in its rack, still polished, still honored, but increasingly dusty. Instead of calligraphy drills, he practiced baguette shaping. Instead of oiling armor, he seasoned baking stones. Still, it was a secret life. You can almost feel the tension in the walls of his little house, the sense of something carefully hidden. One wrong word, one loaf found cooling on the wrong windowsill, and it could all come crashing down. After all, the Tokugawa shogunate wasn't exactly known for its tolerance of foreign influence. Christianity had already been banned. European-style baked goods weren't illegal per se, but they certainly weren't encouraged. Even now, as he removes the first tray from the oven, perfect golden rolls cooling in the dawn air, you sense he's listening for footsteps, listening for someone from the clan compound to come asking why his armor still smells like cinnamon and warm milk. You step back, slowly, quietly, as Takeda places one hand over Gerald's bowl, closes his eyes and bows, not the deep warrior's bow of combat, something gentler, something that says thank you for not exploding overnight, and thank you, perhaps, for reminding him there's more than one kind of honor. You sit down on the edge of a tatami mat, careful not to disturb the delicate symmetry of the teacups arranged along the windowsill. The sun hasn't fully risen, but the kitchen glows gold from the oven's warmth and the gleam of polished copper kettles. There's a stillness here, but not an idle one. It's the kind of purposeful quiet you only find in monasteries, or in kitchens run by ex-samurai bakers with a penchant for radical softness. Takeda Mitsunari is kneeling beside the low table now, scribbling something onto parchment with a bamboo quill. You edge closer and glance at the top of the scroll. The title reads, "Swords, Scrolls, and Sourdough." Beneath that, notes on the diplomacy of loaves. You raise an eyebrow. Surely this is satire. Surely this man, trained in the ancient military tactics of the Takeda clan, is not actually comparing bun shapes to formations used in 16th century cavalry charges. But oh, he is. One diagram features a circle of crusty rolls arranged in what he labels tortoise shell formation. Another shows an elongated loaf flanked by two kneaded knots, flanking maneuver with embedded yeast scouts. It would be hilarious if it weren't so exquisitely detailed. This is where you realize the man isn't just baking, he's strategizing. Gerald, the sourdough starter, has been joined by several offspring, Nakamura, Hana, and Little Ghost. Each one is labeled with rise times, flavor notes, and temperament, because apparently Hana gets bubbly in the summer, but becomes moody during cold spells. Takeda speaks to them like soldiers under his command. "Hana, hold the line," he murmurs while adjusting the clay oven door. Historians still debate whether these names were part of some internal spiritual framework, or just the product of long, lonely pre-dawn hours spent watching flour ferment. Some scholars insist he was attempting to mimic Portuguese naming rituals. Others believe he just got very, very bored. One of the more obscure scrolls discovered in his home after his death, titled The Third Rise, includes an entire meditation on the fleeting nature of gluten integrity and ends with the phrase, "The crust is the armor of the soul." You can't make this up, or rather, someone might have, because to this day, Takeda's story walks a very sleepy line between folklore and documented eccentricity. You watch as he prepares what can only be described as a battle loaf. It's long, segmented, and sprinkled with something that might be black sesame or might be crushed charcoal. He mutters the names of feudal lords as he scores the dough, not out of malice, more like prayer. The room smells now of ash, yeast, and citrus. He's added dried yuzu peel, a local twist on something vaguely European. And next to the cooling rack, a small tray bears today's lunch: pickled daikon, grilled mackerel, and a brioche bun. Here lies one of the great paradoxes of Takeda's life. He didn't renounce his samurai identity. He didn't throw away his armor or burn his scrolls. He just added flour to the equation. He continued his martial studies in private, even teaching local boys how to handle a short blade. But he also taught them how to mix dough until their arms ached and their minds went quiet. To Takeda, bread wasn't rebellion, it was reflection. While other samurai meditated under waterfalls or in sword gardens, he meditated while folding dough. There's one journal entry dated during a time of political upheaval in Edo, in which he writes, "Today the sky was heavy, the town guard suspicious. I fed Gerald twice and baked the long rolls. The silence in the oven reminded me of the silence before battle. It's poetic, a little unsettling, and somehow oddly comforting. He didn't just bake, he shared, quietly, cautiously. A few neighbors, a rice merchant's daughter, an elderly blind man who said the bread sounded soft. One winter, when rice shipments failed and people in the alley went hungry, Takeda handed out flat, chewy barley loaves wrapped in paper prayer charms. He called them weather offerings. No one turned him in. Of course, not everyone approved. One grumpy elder accused Takeda of summoning the ghost of Iberia with his baking. Another said the bread was too quiet and must therefore be suspicious. But when Takeda began adding small rice flour designs to his loaves, carved blossoms, lucky kanji, stylized waves, even the old men began to nod and mutter, "Well, at least it looks Japanese." And here comes the quirky part. Remember that monk from before? The one who left Gerald behind? It turns out he may not have been a monk at all. Later accounts suggest he was once a ship's cook, who faked his ordination after being marooned in Nagasaki. He carried a Portuguese psalter with recipes scrawled in the margins, and a rosary made of baked chickpeas. Gerald was his most loyal companion. Historians still argue whether this monk's story ever intersected fully with Takeda's, or whether the timelines were gently braided together by later storytellers. Some believe Gerald may have passed through multiple hands, growing stronger, smellier, and more metaphorically significant with each stop. But none of that matters here, because as the battle loaf goes into the oven and Gerald burbles faintly in his porcelain bowl, all you can think about is how a single quiet obsession can reroute an entire life. You lie back against the wooden beam behind you, eyes growing heavy. You wonder briefly what today's rolls will be named, probably something like Autumn Resilience or Crust of Falling Leaves. You wouldn't put it past him. And as the room fills with a low, warm crackle, and the scent of toasted citrus rises like incense, you let yourself drift, just a little, into the steam. The steam curls gently from the oven's vent, tracing lazy patterns through the beams overhead, like smoke signals too sleepy to form words. You exhale, matching the rhythm. Takeda, meanwhile, is brushing flour from his sleeves with short, practiced flicks, like a man who's had to conceal a baguette in his kimono more than once. You stay quiet. It's a respectful quiet, the kind reserved for shrines, libraries, and now, apparently, secret samurai bakeries. You watch him lift a tray of newly baked buns, glossy, golden, and whispering the faintest crunch as they cool on bamboo slats. He inspects them with the same scrutiny another man might give to a blade. One imperfect crust, and it goes straight into the compost pile, or rather, the duck donation box, where local waterfowl have been known to congregate for mysterious bread offerings. This level of perfectionism isn't surprising. After all, Takeda was trained under the Bushido Code, a lifestyle that emphasized loyalty, discipline, and not getting your apron tangled in your katana. There are records of him attending formal ceremonies long after his military career ended, still dressed in dignified robes, the faint scent of cardamom clinging to his sleeves. But the path to bread was not entirely smooth. You remember that one time, the flour incident, the inspection, the very nearly career-ending debacle involving a surprise visit from a clan official, a misplaced sack of imported rye flour, and a sneeze that echoed through the hall like a cannon. It was during an annual equipment review. All warriors were required to present their armor, their swords, and their bows for inspection. Everything had to gleam, shine, and be devoid of any suspicious stowaways, say, half a bag of European-style flour tucked behind a breastplate. Takeda had been careful, painstakingly so. He'd triple-wrapped the flour in rice paper, placed it in a storage trunk marked dried fish, and added a few actual dried fish just for cover. But the night before the inspection, he couldn't resist a late-night need. He opened the bag. He made a quick dough. He maybe dusted the countertop, and in his haste, he forgot to change his robe. The next morning, when he bowed before the inspector, a fine white line of flour was visible on the hem of his kimono. Not everyone noticed, but someone did. A young samurai from a rival household raised an eyebrow. "You appear to have fought a ghost," he said dryly, gesturing to the pale streak. Takeda smiled politely. "It was a very clumsy ghost." The moment passed, barely, but Takeda spent the rest of the day rehearsing alibis. "I tripped in a rice storehouse" was the top contender, followed closely by "a pigeon exploded near me." Fortunately, no one pursued it further, or if they did, they kept quiet, possibly in exchange for a loaf. Historians still argue whether this incident marked the moment Takeda resolved to go fully underground with his baking hobby. Some say he even considered shaving his head and posing as a monk to avoid suspicion, but ultimately decided the bald look wasn't for him. Instead, he doubled down on secrecy. He began using a small cellar beneath his house, originally built for storing root vegetables, as his new baking headquarters. It was damp, smoky, and utterly inconvenient, but it was private. He also started wearing what would later be dubbed the baking robe, an old, ink-stained garment with deep sleeves and a suspicious number of flower pockets. According to local legend, he once smuggled an entire tray of proofing rolls through the neighborhood, disguised as a traveling calligraphy teacher. The lengths he went to avoid detection were borderline theatrical. He padded oven doors with silk scraps to muffle the creak. He developed hand signals with his neighbor's cat to alert him of approaching visitors, though the cat, being a cat, ignored most of them. He even invented a fake cough that he'd deploy every time the aroma of cinnamon got too strong. "Allergies," he'd croak as people walked past, noses twitching. But there was one person who almost blew it all wide open. Her name was O Haina, a rice merchant's daughter with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of smell. She delivered rice to Takeda's house every Tuesday. And one morning, as she placed the sack beside his door, she paused, sniffed again. She looked him straight in the eye and asked, "Do you cook Western breakfast?" Takeda blinked. "Excuse me?" She squinted. "My uncle says that smell is what happens when foreign devils toast their bread." He coughed. "Must be incense." She didn't believe him, but she didn't press it. The next week, she returned with an extra jar of pickled plums, and a discreet note that read, "I don't like rice either." They never spoke of it again, but from that day on, she always received the freshest loaf, quietly, wrapped in paper, left by her door before dawn. Historians debate whether O Haina ever truly understood what she'd stumbled into, or if she simply enjoyed being part of a delicious secret. Her name appears only once in Takeda's journals, in a margin note beside a recipe for sweet red bean morning buns. It reads simply, "Test batch for O Haina, less salt." And so the routine continued. Every week, a little more flour. Every month, a new scroll. Every season, a new flavor. You wonder how he managed it all. The balance of silence and yeast, of secrecy and scent. But then again, maybe that's what drew him in. Baking, after all, is about patience, timing, discipline, and surrender. All things a samurai understands. As the last bun cools beside you and the steam thickens into a gentle haze, you feel a deep calm settle into your bones. The flour dust in the air glimmers in the low light like the memory of snow. Somewhere outside, a bell chimes, and inside, Takeda sharpens a wooden butter knife, not for battle, just because it's Tuesday. The air is thick with the scent of toasted sesame and faint charcoal. Somewhere beneath it lingers the unmistakable tang of freshly proofed dough, a scent so gentle, so alive, that even the floorboards seem to exhale with it. Takeda leans over his low table, parchment scrolls spread before him like battle plans, but instead of siege tactics, they're covered with measurements, scribbled ratios, and delicate ink renderings of loaf shapes. You notice one labeled the turtle shell roll for traveling monks. It has notes like holds texture up to 3 days and pairs well with persimmon paste. Next to it, a drawing of a bun shaped like a peony blossom titled simply for ceremonies. Takeda's face is unreadable, but his fingers move with meditative intent. The way he folds the dough, precise, gentle, rhythmic, you realize you're not just watching a baker. You're watching someone practice a kind of edible kata. This is not leisure, this is devotion. But not everyone in the village saw it that way. You begin to remember murmurs from the outer alleys that Takeda wasn't quite right, that he spent too much time alone, that he always smelled like breakfast. Some whispered he was bewitched by a Portuguese demon. Others simply found him unnervingly calm in a world where everyone else was either sharpening swords or arguing about sake prices. So, when he made the decision to leave the safety of his little clay oven and venture, buns in hand, into the port city of Nagasaki, well, that's when things began to get toasted in more ways than one. Nagasaki, in those days, was Japan's singular window to the outside world. Foreigners were forbidden from most of the country, but in Nagasaki, the Dutch and Chinese maintained tiny outposts under strict surveillance. Here, strange things entered Japan. Telescopes, maps, Christian texts disguised as algebra, and pastries. Takeda traveled under the guise of a retired calligraphy tutor. His papers were forged by a friend of Ohaina's, who owed him a debt involving a particularly well-risen holiday loaf. He carried with him a bamboo case lined with cloth, filled not with brushes but with rolls. He'd heard a rumor that in a narrow Dutch warehouse on the edge of the port, someone was making almond pastries. This was a dangerous curiosity, not life-threatening perhaps, but politically delicate. Samurai were supposed to uphold the cultural code, not nibble foreign confections under cover of night. He found the warehouse by following the smell, sweet, nutty, buttery. He knocked, was met with confusion, and then, surprisingly, with an invitation. A bored Dutch clerk let him in, muttering something about the strange Japanese poet who wanted marzipan. And there, behind crates of dried herring and brass instruments, was a Dutch baker, half asleep, eating his own failed batch of macarons. Historians still debate whether Takeda shared any of his own rolls that day. Some say he traded one for a handful of almonds. Others say the Dutch baker took one bite and wept, declaring it the soul of Kyoto wrapped in a blanket of wheat. Probably not, but it's nice to imagine. What we do know is that Takeda left Nagasaki with a notebook full of observations. Almond paste consistency, clove blending ratios, techniques for double baking crusts. It was this trip that introduced him to rye flour, nutmeg, and, perhaps most fatefully, yeast-leavened fruit buns. The fruit incident, as it came to be known later in his journals, involved an overly ambitious attempt to blend raisins, citron peel, and miso into a single roll. The result was what he gently described as meditatively unpleasant. Still, he persisted. Upon returning to his quiet Edo home, he set out to recreate not the pastries themselves, but the feeling they gave him, that mix of familiarity and foreignness, the gentle surprise of something almost like home, but not quite. He created what he called dream buns, small, soft-centered rolls, brushed with honey and filled with sweet red bean paste, then topped with a whisper of almond. Not quite European, not quite Japanese, but somehow both. This was when things got serious. Neighbors began knocking at odd hours. At first, it was for polite reasons. A spoon of soy sauce, they'd ask, a sprig of shiso leaf, but their eyes wandered toward the oven. They lingered at the doorway. One woman asked outright, "Do you sell these?" Takeda didn't respond. He simply handed her a bun, bowed, and closed the door. Within weeks, word had spread, quietly, like steam through a futon. There was bread in the alley, not rice buns, not mochi, bread, real bread. Of course, it couldn't last. One autumn morning, a young samurai from a neighboring district arrived unannounced. Not a local, not a friend. He carried a short blade and an attitude like burnt soy. He claimed to be investigating foreign culinary corruptions. He demanded an explanation. Takeda offered him a seat. He served him tea, and then, with calm and ceremony, he placed a single dream bun before him on a plate made from repurposed roof tile. The samurai sniffed. He frowned. He took a bite. He chewed. He stared at Takeda for a long time. Then he nodded once, slowly, and said, "This would go well with pickled eggplant." And just like that, the investigation was closed. Historians still argue whether this event was staged or whether the samurai was simply bribed with good carbs. Either way, the message was clear. Takeda had reached a threshold. He wasn't just baking for himself anymore. He was baking for others. And while the law didn't yet know what to do with that, the neighborhood had already decided. The quiet man with the flowery robes and the solemn buns was now, unofficially, their baker. You wake, just a little, to the faint sound of scraping, wooden tongs on clay, and the click of a kettle lid being lifted. Takeda is already at work again, this time with a fresh sheet of parchment pinned under a stone and paperweight shaped like a gourd. On it, he's sketching another set of rolls, but this time they're triangular. He taps the page with the end of his brush. Too pointy, he mutters. You smile, just slightly, because this, apparently, is what rebellion looks like in the hands of a quiet man with an oven and too much imagination. But rebellion has consequences, and that moment, the bun being served to a suspicious visitor, the faint nod of approval, it didn't go unnoticed, because the scent of warm bread may be subtle, but in a city like Edo, where every alley breathes gossip, nothing stays secret for long. Which brings us to one of the oddest chapters in Takeda Mitsunari's life, the rice tax incident. See, every household in Edo had to pay rice tax, especially those tied to former samurai status. Rice was everything, currency, commodity, social ladder. Even if you were out of work, you owed a portion of your rice allotment to your overlords. And Takeda, ever the dutiful former warrior, delivered his tax every season like clockwork. But one year, something shifted. Instead of his usual precisely measured rice parcels, he showed up at the local storehouse with buns. Not wheat buns. That would have been ridiculous. These were a mix of rice flour, barley, and a tiny dash of sweet potato, shaped to resemble ceremonial mochi, but lightly leavened and, how to say it, suspiciously delicious. The tax officer, an aging bureaucrat named Masuda, who reportedly had only 3 functioning teeth and 0 sense of whimsy, stared at the offering. He sniffed it, poked it, declared it structurally unclear. Takeda, calm as ever, replied, "It is still rice." Masuda frowned. "It is rice transformed." Takeda bowed. "As is such." There was silence, a long, tense, perfectly cooked silence. Historians still debate what happened next. Some claim Masuda simply didn't want to rewrite the paperwork. Others suggest he took one bite and promptly redefined his entire worldview. Either way, the buns were accepted. Takeda's rice tax, for that year at least, was paid in bread. It was the beginning of a quiet shift. People began whispering not just about the taste, but about the idea that perhaps not all rice had to be steamed, that perhaps a samurai's duty didn't end with the sword, that maybe, just maybe, bread had a place in the heart of tradition. Of course, this caused friction, especially among the elders, many of whom viewed wheat as a suspicious foreign invader. One elderly priest reportedly declared, "Wheat has no soul, it does not weep when pounded." Another wrote a 4-verse poem lamenting the decline of proper gruel. Takeda, for his part, didn't argue. He simply continued baking. But he did make one small adjustment. He built an oven beneath his veranda. This wasn't just any oven. It was modeled after old Portuguese clay ovens, but adapted for stealth. The chimney was disguised as a broken lantern post. The fuel? Dried persimmon twigs and driftwood, smokeless, nearly scentless, unless you got very close. He worked mostly at night, his baking stones warmed by coals hidden beneath a layer of ash. From above, his house looked perfectly ordinary. But below, beneath the floorboards, history was quietly rising. And this is when the scrolls really began. Takeda, ever the scholar, started recording not just recipes, but thoughts, musings, philosophies, little drifting phrases about dough and honor and the nature of time. One scroll begins, "The rice obeys its steam, the wheat listens to nothing, it resists, it delays, it becomes." Another reads, "A warrior cuts once, a baker folds endlessly, both seek silence." You're not sure if he meant it all metaphorically, or if he just really liked kneading dough while thinking about war. But it didn't stop there. As demand for his bread grew, quietly, carefully, he began to develop a sort of code, a symbolic way to communicate availability without raising suspicion. 3 stones arranged beside his front gate meant fresh rolls. A sprig of mint on the windowsill meant almond buns today. If the wind chime rang 3 times, he was out of flour. Only those in the know understood the signals. Oh, Hana, of course, always did. She became his unofficial distributor, leaving small paper-wrapped packages beside fish stalls, behind shrine lanterns, on the back of stray cats. Okay, maybe not the cats, but it feels like something she would do. And then came the Rice Merchants Festival. Every spring, local traders gathered for a quiet celebration, a mix of market stalls, poetry contests, and the extremely competitive Best Pickled Plum competition. Takeda, somehow, was invited to submit a food item. Not officially, of course, but a note was slipped under his door. If you were to offer something, we would probably eat it. So he did. He submitted a small, square-shaped bun filled with azuki bean paste and brushed with a glaze made of miso, sake, and brown sugar. He called it Rice Respects Wheat. It did not win the competition, but it sold out, and a week later, one of the judges returned in secret and asked for 12 more. For my aunt, he claimed. She's very curious. And so, with quiet feet and warm hands, Takeda Mitsunari became not just a baker, but a provider, a roomer, a symbol. His oven flickered, his dough rose, and the neighborhood, bit by bit, began to smell less like soy and fish and more like crust. The morning light filters in now, slow and golden, casting faint lines across the scrolls that still litter Takeda's work table. You're reclined in a patch of warmth on the floor, watching dust motes drift lazily through the air like sleepy lanterns. Somewhere behind you, the oven ticks as it cools. It's quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from nothing happening. No, this is the full-bellied, crust-scented quiet of a job well done. But Takeda is already planning his next move. He sits cross-legged, examining a faded drawing pinned to the wall, a diagram of a ceremonial tea gathering. The guests are seated in a half-circle. The host kneels, serene. In front of him, instead of tea utensils, there is a bun, carefully positioned on a black lacquered tray. You blink. He wouldn't dare, but he would. And he did. Because this next chapter in Takeda's strange journey involves a tea master, a garden full of philosophers, and a sesame bun so soft it nearly caused a spiritual crisis. The tea master's name was Fujiwara Rintaro, and he was considered one of the most serene men in Edo. His movements were poetry. His voice never rose above a whisper. He once stared at a falling leaf for 3 hours and called it productive. So when word reached Rintaro that a former samurai was baking rolls as soft as silence, he was intrigued. An invitation arrived, hand-delivered, sealed with a pressed camellia. Takeda was summoned to participate in a moon viewing ceremony held at the tea master's private garden. The note was vague. Bring nothing except what cannot be seen. Takeda interpreted this in the only way that made sense to him. He brought bread. He arrived just before twilight, dressed in a charcoal gray robe and carrying a small wooden box lined with silk. Inside it was a single bun, shaped like the full moon. It was brushed with sweet sake, glazed until it shimmered faintly in the candlelight. When his turn came in the ceremony, Takeda knelt. He bowed, and then, ever so gently, he placed the bun on the offering tray. The room stilled. You could have heard a bamboo leaf land on silk. Rintaro leaned in. He examined the bun. He sniffed. Then, to everyone's horror and fascination, he took a bite and chewed, slowly, thoughtfully. Then he said, "This is the flavor of quiet regret, served warm." Takeda, of course, bowed. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of poetry and awkward coughing. No one was quite sure if the bun had offended the spirits or elevated the ceremony to a higher plane of awareness. But from that day on, Rintaro became Takeda's unlikely supporter. The tea master began requesting those contemplative buns for select guests, mostly poets, monks, and one retired actor who claimed they cured his sleepwalking. They were delivered discreetly, always wrapped in gray cloth, always left at the back gate. This marked a turning point, because suddenly, Takeda wasn't just a baker, he was a provider of mood. His bread was no longer just food, it was philosophy in crust. Of course, this came with its own set of problems. You remember the time a minor noble demanded a dozen emotionally resonant rolls for a marriage proposal. Takeda complied, but the proposal failed. The rolls, it turns out, were too introspective. The bride-to-be reportedly bit into one and began weeping about the impermanence of things. Still, his reputation spread, and with it came a quiet storm of bureaucracy. One drizzly morning, a courier from the local governor's office arrived, drenched, unimpressed, and holding an official scroll. Takeda opened it carefully, expecting a reprimand, but instead it read, "Report to the Hall of Civil Records, bring samples." Takeda sighed. This was it, the moment when the quiet experiment would either end in disgrace or take on a strange, state-sanctioned form. He arrived at the hall with a lacquered bento box of assorted rolls, autumn regret, crispy enlightenment, neutral bun for diplomatic occasions. He sat in a waiting chamber for nearly 2 hours while clerks argued over whether bread qualified as public nourishment or unauthorized fluff. Finally, a middle-ranking official named Kenji entered. Kenji was known for 3 things: his deeply furrowed brow, his obsession with herbal remedies, and his unshakable belief that everything, including tofu, should be steamed. He sniffed at the box, frowned, and asked, "What is the purpose of this loaf?" Takeda, ever the poet, replied, "To remind one that heat can be gentle." Kenji blinked. "So, it's a bun?" "Yes." There was a long pause. Then Kenji asked, "Does it pair with pickled radish?" Takeda nodded. "Perfectly." A second pause. Then Kenji plucked a roll from the tray, took a bite, and said, with full bureaucratic solemnity, "This will require a new form." Historians still argue whether this event led directly to Takeda receiving a semi-official baking assignment. Some records suggest that a new civil position was created, unofficially labeled Peaceful Nourishment Liaison. Others believe Kenji simply began requesting bread weekly and pretended it was a wellness initiative. Either way, Takeda's rolls were now in circulation. Monks ordered them for meditation retreats. Courtiers requested whisper crusts for sleepless nights. One famously grumpy district scribe claimed Takeda's bread helped him complete 5 years' worth of backlogged tax paperwork in a single week. The oven beneath the veranda worked overtime, and through it all, Takeda remained quiet, steady, hands dusted with flour, soul wrapped in steam. You glance around the room now, everything is tidy again. No scrolls, no chaos, just a single loaf cooling beside the kettle. It's shaped like a sleeping cat. You don't ask, you just close your eyes and listen to the bread settle. You drift back into focus to the soft sound of a wooden wind chime tapping in the morning breeze. The loaf shaped like a sleeping cat still rests on its tray, now crusted with a perfect golden edge. Takeda is gone for the moment, off in the garden, perhaps, tending to his citrus trees or collecting firewood with the same silent efficiency he applies to buns. But his presence still lingers, like the scent of toasted rice flour in the rafters. You stretch slightly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the place. The house is alive in its stillness, a space halfway between dojo and bakery, monastery and kitchen. You almost expect the floorboards to whisper ancient proverbs about butter. And then you notice the ledger. Tucked between 2 bamboo scroll holders is a plain brown book, its corners darkened from use. You open it cautiously. The paper is thin and delicate, filled with ink-stained notes in Takeda's crisp, elegant hand. But this isn't a cookbook. It's a schedule. Delivery routes, customer codes, loaf variations based on day, weather, and emotional temperament. You scan an entry. Tuesday, cloudy. Widow Hasegawa, 1, gentle sadness bun, unsalted. Monk Ichiro, 2, silent joys must arrive warm. Bureaucrat Kenji, bread of no opinion, crust to be faint. This was no hobby. This was a life. You can see it now. Takeda slipping through alleys before dawn, robes dusted in flour, leaving warm packages on stone steps and tucked into shrine niches. A one-man supply chain of serenity. The logistics alone are staggering. He had no apprentices, no assistants, just a network of subtle nods and quiet helpers. Oh, Haina, of course, and probably the odd sympathetic lantern keeper or street sweep who enjoyed a hot breakfast. But even Takeda couldn't stay hidden forever, because one evening, as he was placing a parcel of evening reflection loaves into a lacquered box for the temple, there came a knock, a polite knock, too polite. He opened the door to find a pair of officials in ceremonial robes, not the angry kind. Worse, the curious kind. One of them cleared his throat. "We are here to sample the crust." Takeda bowed, slowly. "On behalf of His Excellency." Ah, that explained it. The shogun, it turned out, had heard rumors, faint, crumb-dusted rumors, of a retired swordsman who speaks to dough. Naturally, he assumed it was code for a covert operation or some heretical cult. But no, it was just bread. Still, to be safe, he'd sent his food taster, and so Takeda packed a tray. 5 carefully chosen items. A matcha-kissed sweet roll called green patience, a savory barley bun glazed with yuzu, courage with salt, a spongy white loaf called cloud shadow, a modest dinner roll labeled only neutral, and of course a tiny cinnamon twist named discreet joy. He handed the tray to the emissary without a word. The next day, a note arrived. The emperor slept well. You may continue. Historians still argue whether this message was literal or symbolic. Did the shogun actually eat the buns? Did he nod off after? Or was it simply court code for proceed quietly and never speak of this again? Regardless, the message was clear. Takeda was, for now, safe. And so he leaned into the ambiguity. He never opened an official bakery. That would have been too bold. But the deliveries continued, slowly, steadily, like river water through bamboo. And new kinds of bread appeared. You flip through the ledger again, marveling at the creativity. There's window rain loaf, a bread designed to be eaten while watching drizzle. Retired lantern keeper's buns, made with roasted chestnut. Even a festival of regret roll. A sweet and sour concoction that caused 3 known marriage reconciliations and 1 mysterious disappearance. But Takeda didn't just bake for others, he baked for himself. 1 page in the ledger is written differently. Looser script, slight smudges. It reads, baking notes, sleepless night, dough refused to rise. Gerald sluggish, considered abandoning whole batch. Did not. Folded again and again. Eventually, warmth. A lesson. You close the book gently. It's clear now that baking was his journal, his dojo, his shrine. The oven was both hearth and confession box. And the rolls? A quiet record of his days, each one shaped by weather, mood, and memory. And sometimes by ghosts. Yes, there's a section, half faded, about the bread left for ancestors. Once a month, on the darkest night, Takeda would leave a special roll on the back porch. No name, no garnish, just crust, for those who came before. He believed the scent helped guide them home. You don't question it. You just look toward the veranda, where a small plate now sits empty, save for a single poppy seed. And you imagine, just for a moment, that somewhere beyond the misty alley, a quiet ancestor smiles. You don't know when you dozed off, but when you stir, Takeda is back at the hearth, crouched low, gently rotating a tray as though the angle of heat were a matter of personal dignity. The light outside is brighter now, filtered through a curtain of plum blossoms swaying in the breeze. The house creaks once, politely, and settles into its usual rhythm of baking, breathing, and existing about 4 centimeters above the worries of the world. But something is different, because on the table, between the flour-dusted scrolls and the warm pot of barley tea, lies a folded letter with a very official seal. You watch, barely breathing, as Takeda opens it. He reads it slowly, lips unmoving. Then he closes his eyes, breathes out, and murmurs, "Ah." That is the sound of a man who's just been noticed by someone very high up. As it turns out, the Emperor slept well note from weeks earlier was not the end of the story. No, it was merely the opening sentence. Because now, the court has a request. A gentle, vague, but utterly unavoidable request. The shogunate has decided that Takeda's peculiar meditative buns might be of benefit to certain bureaucratic functions, specifically the ones where people fall asleep or become mysteriously enraged over grain quotas. And so the letter reads, "We humbly invite the Honorable Takeda Mitsunari to contribute a small number of his restorative rolls to monthly meetings of the Intercourt Civil Harmony Council. Compensation will be arranged in the form of silence." Takeda smiles just barely, because that is a very specific phrase. In bureaucratic speak, compensation in the form of silence means they'll leave you alone. No inspections, no further questions, no surprise visits with forms labeled wheat-related cultural deviations. In other words, permission. Not official, not in writing, but real enough. The kind of nod that says, "We see you. Keep baking." And so begins a new chapter. The era of the semi-official, state-sanctioned, slightly secret samurai bakery. Deliveries are made through intermediaries, Rolls arrive at the Civil Harmony Council, wrapped in plain rice paper, stacked neatly in lacquered boxes labeled Meeting Nutriment. Clerks whisper that the green speckled ones reduce tension, that the pink glazed variety makes budget discussions 17% shorter. Kenji, ever the loyal mid-tier bureaucrat, becomes the informal liaison. He insists on weekly samples. For research, he claims, though he's clearly just partial to anything with yuzu zest. And in return, Takeda receives something even more valuable than silver: quiet. No more sidelong glances from the guard post. No more questioning stares at the market. His flour shipments arrive unmarked. His firewood deliveries are larger than requested. One week, a retired scribe even shows up unannounced to offer help cleaning the oven. No charge, he says, just don't stop. It's not a shop, never that. But it's becoming something very close. One scroll from this time, titled Crumbs and Calm, reveals Takeda's thinking. I do not want fame, but I will accept peace. If they want quiet crusts, I will bake them. He begins experimenting again. New loaves, shaped like bells or folding fans. One is infused with roasted buckwheat and yume vinegar, designed for difficult meetings. Another is filled with roasted tea leaves, wrapped around a core of soft rice pudding. This one he names Temporary Clarity. One particularly daring roll includes dried chrysanthemum petals soaked in plum wine. It's meant for senior advisors who keep talking about tax reform long after everyone wants to go home. You begin to notice how strategic this is, because while Takeda remains humble, silent even, his bread is going places. Important places. One roll appears at a poetry reading hosted by the governor's wife. Another is spotted during a nighttime astronomy gathering in the castle gardens. A third becomes the centerpiece of a small Zen retreat where the monks reportedly debate for 6 hours whether the crust represents attachment or detachment. Historians still argue about this period. Was Takeda manipulating the system? Was he playing a quiet game of influence, loaf by loaf? Or was he simply baking what the people needed and letting the rolls do the talking? Either way, the effect is real. People start referring to his creations in hushed tones: the calming bun, the meeting savor, that thing you eat before asking for vacation. And somehow Takeda becomes a presence, a ghostly figure of calm at the edge of power. He never attends a council meeting. He never receives an official title, but every month his buns arrive on time, wrapped in paper, warm, perfect. And with each delivery, the scent drifts a little further across the city, into libraries, into shrine kitchens, into the private quarters of an elderly general who claims it's the only thing that helps his gout. Even the guards at the outer gate start humming a tune called Oven Whispers when the delivery boy passes by. You glance back at Takeda now, seated once again by the clay hearth, stirring a pot of sweet potato filling. His shoulders are relaxed, his face serene. His sword still rests in its rack, untouched for months. And yet, you can tell, he's never been more powerful. Not in the loud, dramatic sense, but in the way a steady flame softens iron, the way a good crust changes a room. The steam curls from the kettle in long, lazy spirals, rising towards the wooden beams where a single spider has made the world's most contemplative web. Outside, the plum blossoms shiver in the breeze, and inside the house, Takeda Mitsunari is spreading butter on a roll as though it were lacquer on a ceremonial tea bowl, slow, reverent, precise. You are now deep into what historians later called the toasted crust era. This is when Takeda's baking began to shift from quiet indulgence into something perilously close to fame, but not the loud kind. No, Takeda's renown crept up like yeast in warm weather, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The official request from the Civil Harmony Council had opened the floodgates, albeit very politely. Now, couriers appeared at odd hours with notes that began, "If the honorable baker is not too troubled," or "Should the oven still be warm, and the spirit willing." Requests came from all corners of Edo. One was from a sleepless astronomer who claimed Takeda's barley poppy seed rolls clarified the stars. Another was from a widow who hadn't smiled in 2 years, until she bit into a cinnamon crescent and declared it almost worth remarrying for. But nothing drew attention quite like the trial of the toasted crust. You hear the phrase and imagine something absurd, a samurai dueling a loaf in court, perhaps. but the truth is stranger and just plausible enough to have actually happened. It began with a rival. His name was Arai Nobushiga, a second-tier samurai, very traditional, very loud about it, and fiercely proud of his rice flour mochi. He wore a robe embroidered with clouds and thunderbolts, and once wrote a 12-verse poem on the superiority of boiled grain. No one liked him, but everyone tolerated him, until, one fateful afternoon, his youngest son brought home one of Takeda's loaves. It was the almond-glazed one. Subtle triumph, if you recall. The son took one bite, sighed deeply, and said, "Father, this has warmth." Arai was appalled. He demanded the loaf be burned. Then he stormed into the Civil Harmony office and declared that unauthorized foreign bread is infecting our young with softness. There was a pause. Then someone, probably Kenji, suggested a test, a fair one. Let the bread stand trial. And so, a week later, in a low-ceilinged administrative chamber known mostly for settling arguments about compost bins, a tribunal was held. 3 officials. 1 scroll keeper, 1 very nervous clerk with crumbs on his collar. Takeda was summoned. He arrived in plain robes, carrying a bamboo tray lined with warm cloth. Inside were 5 small loaves, each with a name and a description. They read like poetry. Restraint, moderate encouragement, soft decision, harmony in crust, final word. The judges were unimpressed. Arai was furious. They do not steam, they do not bounce, they do not honor the rice. Takeda bowed, said nothing. Kenji coughed and took a bite of harmony in crust. He chewed. He nodded. Then, very softly, he said, "I no longer fear my inbox." The scrollkeeper documented this without comment. Arai demanded to speak. He launched into a 15-minute tirade about cultural erosion and the spiritual danger of yeast. At some point, he shouted, "What kind of man tempers dough with his heart?" Takeda finally responded. He said, "The same kind who tempers steel with water." There was a long pause, and that was the moment. Historians still debate the significance of this trial. Some claim it was just an elaborate excuse for free bread. Others argue it marked a symbolic shift in what it meant to live by the sword, or rather, beyond it. Either way, the verdict was clear. No laws had been broken, no rice had been dishonored, and the buns, as one judge put it, tasted like clarity. Arai left in disgrace, and the next morning, someone anonymously ordered 24 soft decision rolls to be delivered to the House of Internal Planning. The legend only grew from there. Poets started referencing his bread in passing. One famously wrote, "The warrior kneels, but not before the blade, before the oven's hush." A local painter created a scroll titled "Steam in Silence," depicting a kneeling Takeda bathed in morning light, flanked by loaves arranged like chess pieces. It was banned for excessive tranquility. Takeda, for his part, remained unfazed. He continued waking at dawn, checking Gerald and the other starters. Hana, Nakamura, and Little Ghost were joined now by a new addition, Matsu. Matsu was temperamental and sometimes hissed unexpectedly, but produced the softest interior crumb of any starter to date. You glance over at the hearth where Matsu currently rests under a cloth that reads, "Handle with respect and also warm hands." Takeda's scrolls became more whimsical during this time. One entry reads, "Today I shaped a loaf like a turtle. I did not know why, but it felt correct." Another notes, "The oven gave me a quiet day. The crust sang. I wrote no reply." It's here you realize he wasn't just baking bread. He was shaping quiet into edible form. The world, noisy and chaotic beyond the garden walls, melted each morning into soft interior crumb and golden edge. Takeda never claimed to be more than a man with flour on his sleeves and thoughts he couldn't quite say out loud. But somewhere between the shaping and the silence, the city began to breathe a little easier. And so did you. The late afternoon sun has dipped below the rooftops, casting the room in that warm, apricot-tinted glow that makes even the shadows feel sleepy. The oven door stands ajar now, its fire reduced to coals that crackle faintly like old paper. You've lost track of time entirely, which, around here, is more a compliment than a concern. Takeda sits at his low desk again, head tilted thoughtfully as he writes something onto a scrap of cloth instead of paper. You don't ask why, you've learned not to. What you do notice is the scroll hanging just beside the hearth, newly inked, still drying. The calligraphy is clean, but the message is odd. Cloud-soft rolls must be made slowly, or they may become ambitious. You nod. Yes, that makes sense. Sort of. Because Takeda's rolls are no longer just delicious. They're now requested by people who, until recently, wouldn't have known a crust from a cloud. His quiet defiance, once cloaked in baking and delivered in silence, has become something unexpected. Civic nourishment. You blink at that phrase, but it's real. You saw it yourself, inked at the bottom of a city ledger under newly sanctioned initiatives, right between lantern repair pilot program and emergency carp distribution. And yes, this is how history often happens, not with grand declarations, but with someone quietly slipping a cinnamon bun into a meeting room while no one is looking. The scrolls in Takeda's house have multiplied. Many are now tagged with strings of red twine and sorted by mood. One corner is labeled loaves for tension, another meditative breads, and your favorite unknown but comforting. And then there are the test loaves. Today, Takeda is working on one called Even Kindness, a gentle white bun infused with chrysanthemum tea and the tiniest amount of salt. He says it's meant for monks, though it may also be for the governor's nephew, who's apparently very nervous about his marriage prospects. But not everything goes to plan. You witness it happen for the first time. The oven door is opened too early. The air rushes in. The dough, perfectly risen just moments ago, collapses into itself like a startled squirrel. Takeda sighs. He doesn't yell. He doesn't stomp. He simply bows his head and whispers something that might be a prayer, or might just be a reminder to pre-warm the oven longer next time. Then, he tears the scroll in half and starts over. Because here's the truth. Takeda's buns are still experimental. He's not a commercial baker. There are no guaranteed hits. Every batch carries the chance of imperfection. Too dense, too dry, too introspective. Some rolls, he says, are too emotionally specific and should never be eaten during seasonal transitions. But that hasn't stopped the requests. In fact, it's made them more specific. There's now a district official who wants a roll to help him focus during budget meetings. Nothing sweet, he specifies, but not judgmental either. A retired geisha writes requesting a soft bun that doesn't interrupt my memories. And the monks at the nearby temple have asked for loaves they can listen to as they cool. Takeda naturally complies. And so the rolls come, soft, crisp, uncertain, certain, paired with ginger or barley or memory. They arrive by hand, by cart, by bird-shaped message pouch. Oh, Haina's doing, most likely. One afternoon, a group of traveling actors stops by the alley. They've heard rumors of the bun that makes you remember who you are. Takeda serves them something flaky, filled with roasted sweet potato and smoked salt. They eat in silence. One of them cries, then performs a monologue about his childhood shoe. You don't question it, because the bread somehow keeps speaking. There is one roll in particular, plain-looking, crust slightly uneven, that causes quite a stir among the scribes of the city. It's nicknamed the pause, because everyone who eats it pauses mid-sentence. Some stare at the wall. Others briefly forget what they were doing. The shogun's scribe tries it. He forgets 3 appointments, writes a haiku about ducks, and sleeps for 14 hours. Takeda is asked to limit distribution of the pause to weekends only. But perhaps the most curious development is that Takeda is now being watched. Not in a sinister way, more like academically. Scholars, real ones, with scrolls and terrible sandals, begin showing up near his alley, pretending to be interested in the architecture while casually sniffing the air. One publishes an essay titled Flower, Form, and the Dissolution of Warrior Identity in Post-Medieval Edo. Another writes a deeply confused poem. He once held steel, now sourdough, but both slice silence. Even the monastery is getting involved. A senior monk sends Takeda a question on rice paper. If the bun is quiet but the oven sings, who is meditating? Takeda replies, both, if the timing is right. And just like that, he becomes a minor philosopher. People begin quoting his oven notes as if they were Zen koans. A few even gather outside his home before sunrise, just to breathe in the first wave of steam. One woman brings her anxious dog, claiming the bread calms him. And you? You find yourself returning again and again to the same thought, that somehow, against all odds, a former warrior has become the city's most peaceful influence, armed not with steel, but with warmth, discipline, and exactly the right amount of cardamom. As the sun fades into that lovely shade of gold before blue, Takora sets down a new loaf to cool. It's small, square, unglazed. On the parchment beside it, he writes, "Bread for a city that thinks too much," and you begin to understand why it matters. The evening has rolled in softly, with a breeze that smells faintly of river reeds and someone's nearby miso stew. The light from Takeda's oven glows amber now, a small sun in a house built for patience. From somewhere down the alley comes the rhythmic clop of Geta sandals and the sleepy clatter of shutters being drawn for the night. But in this house, the bakery never fully sleeps. You watch as Takeda ties his hair back with a strip of cloth that bears faint flower stains in the shape of possibly a koi fish, or maybe just wishful thinking. His sleeves are already rolled. The bowl is clean. Gerald, the sourdough starter, is bubbling contentedly, as if whispering encouragement, because tonight's batch is important. Tonight, Takeda is baking a loaf for someone he's never met, but whose presence has loomed quietly for some time. Her name is Kyo, a civil servant in the Ministry of Irrigation, and according to a whisper passed along by Ohina, she hasn't slept in 4 months. Not due to illness or insomnia, but because she's been drafting a new canal system map so complex it makes grown men weep. Her colleagues say she mutters about drainage in her sleep. One clerk claims she once hallucinated a talking eel, and so, naturally, someone suggested she try the bread. No one specified which one. Takeda sits cross-legged, considering. He flips through his scrolls, pausing briefly at steady stream loaf, quiet river bun, and salted focus, but nothing feels quite right. Then he sets the scroll aside and closes his eyes. You watch as he begins, not with the ingredients, but with the mood. This is Takeda's gift, not just his hands, but his ability to understand the unspoken. He listens to the city as though it's a kettle about to boil. He reads the stillness in a room. He hears a name like Kyo and knows, instinctively, that she needs not comfort, but permission to stop. And so he begins to knead. Not fast, not slow, just enough. He chooses barley flour for grounding, a hint of roasted brown rice for familiarity, and a pinch of dried sakura petals, because sometimes the smell of spring is enough to remind a poor person that their brain isn't on fire. He calls it the gentle halt. While the dough rises, he prepares the packaging, a thin strip of bamboo, wrapped around the loaf with a tiny paper slip tucked inside. On it, written in ink only slightly smudged from steam, is a message. You may resume later, or not at all. The loaf is delivered before dawn. No signature, no mark, just steam and silence. You'll never know if Kyo cried or laughed or slept for 10 uninterrupted hours. But weeks later, Ohina reports that the new canal map contains one odd, unexplained detour, shaped remarkably like a loaf. This is what it means now to be Takeda Mitsunari. You affect the world gently, through crumbs and warmth. But not every consequence is quiet, because with fame, even the sleepy, crust-scented kind, comes chaos. And soon, the neighborhood begins to change. More people begin to move into the area. They want to live closer to the bakery, even though it doesn't technically exist. A tea house opens nearby, promising complimentary buns with every third sigh. Someone starts selling handmade scrolls titled The Way of the Loaf. A pair of young merchants launch a bun rating guide, which quickly devolves into heated arguments about whether soft decision or gentle halt pairs better with plum wine. One man claims he had a vision while eating a barley roll and opens a school of contemplative fencing called crust form. Takeda, of course, ignores all of this, but the pressure begins to mount. He wakes earlier, works longer, starts taking fewer notes, and one morning you notice something odd. Gerald, the starter, looks tired. It's hard to explain. A little flat, a little sluggish, like he's been overfed with expectations. Takeda doesn't panic. He just adjusts, recalibrates, begins using Little Ghost and Matsu more often, rotating the starters in quiet rhythm. But you see it in his face. The city has caught up with him. What was once private is now public. What was once offered is now expected. There's a difference between baking to soothe and baking to satisfy. So he tries something else. He creates a new loaf. One that's not on the schedule, not in the scrolls, not requested. It has no filling, no glaze. It's not sweet, not savory. It's just present. He names it Here, and it is, perhaps, the strangest thing he's ever made. People are baffled. Some say it tastes like wind. Others say it reminds them of childhood naps. A man with a bad haircut claims it cured his fear of bees. And Takeda? He just nods and writes one line in the scroll beside the oven. A loaf is not a solution. It is an invitation to breathe. The world continues spinning outside. The market stalls, the courtly gossip, the eel-related stress. But in this house, something remarkable is still happening. Baking as quiet rebellion, bread as whisper, and you, still seated on the tatami mat, know something else too. That the story, warm and rising, isn't just about dough. It's about choosing a life with fewer sharp edges, and learning to serve stillness, one loaf at a time. You wake to the faint creak of the house stretching its joints in the cool pre-dawn air. The kettle has just begun its sleepy rattle, and the oven glows with that familiar amber hush. The scent is new today, earthier, deeper, with notes of roasted grain and something faintly nutty. Takeda is at the table again, but he's not kneading, not sketching. He's simply sitting, one hand resting lightly on the shoulder of Little Ghost's ceramic bowl, the other holding a small wooden box. The box contains, you quickly realize, memories. Inside are tokens from a life lived sideways through history. A child's sandal long since outgrown, a hairpin carved with the Takeda clan's mon, a frayed scroll tied with plum-dyed ribbon, and nestled among them, a tiny time-worn sketch of a young woman smiling while holding a roll. You don't have to ask who she is. This is when you learn of Takeda's great-granddaughter. Her name was Aiko, and she was, if the fading ink is to be believed, both wildly impatient and the only person Takeda ever allowed in the kitchen without knocking. She grew up in this house, in this warm oven glow, helping him mix barley flour with too much water and naming each misshapen roll after sea creatures. She once tried to bake a loaf shaped like a fox and ended up with something that looked like a guilty shoe. Takeda said it was perfect. She asked questions no one else dared to. Why can't bread have eyes? Why do scrolls have to be serious? Can the starter be fed poetry? Takeda said yes, always yes. She left as she grew older, off to Kyoto, to learn medicine, or maybe painting. It was never entirely clear, but the house remained hers in spirit. Every solstice, she sent him a drawing of a bun, sometimes smiling, sometimes angry, once, a roll weeping tiny tears of jam. And when Takeda passed, long after his oven had cooled and the scrolls had yellowed at the edges, it was Aiko who returned. She came in the quiet of winter, barefoot, hair wild, wearing a cloak stitched with hand-drawn bread patterns. Neighbors didn't know what to make of her. Some called her eccentric. Others said she was the final loaf. She found Gerald still resting in his bowl, barely alive but breathing, and she brought him back. With rice flour, cherry blossom honey, and a poem she wrote on mulberry bark that began, "It's okay to be mostly yeast." She reopened the oven, swept the house, and began to bake. Not the same way. Her style was louder, more playful, buns with eyebrows, scrolls filled with nonsense poems and crust jokes. But the spirit was the same. People returned, older now, grayer, but they remembered. And with her own flour-dusted hands, Aiko turned the bakery that wasn't a bakery into something quietly permanent. A cultural landmark, technically, but not the kind with velvet ropes or plaques. Just a house, still warm, still crust-scented, still leaving small packages on stone steps at dawn. You visit it now in your mind, and see her there, laughing as a batch of unnecessary rolls collapses in the oven. She shrugs, scribbles, maybe not everything rises on a chalkboard, and starts again. Visitors sit on the old floorboards, no music, just the sound of baking, and maybe the wind chimes that never quite stay in tune. Aiko takes notes in a new ledger. This one has doodles, sure, but also the names of people who needed something. Rest, reflection, just a snack. And somewhere in the margins, always, the quiet presence of Takeda. In a way, his legacy isn't the bread, it's the space, the warmth. The willingness to create softness in a world that too often demanded sharpness. Historians will try to write him into footnotes. Food scholars will argue about the yeast. Some will call him an eccentric. Others, a hidden revolutionary. But you know the truth. He was just a man who turned inward and found, at the bottom of the bowl, something worth sharing. And now, years later, generations removed, his recipes still whisper. You catch one of them now, drifting on the steam from the memory of his oven. Let each fold be a kindness. Let each rise be patient. Let each crust remind you, warmth can be chosen. And as the last light fades from this house, the room begins to glow with the impossible brightness of something deeply remembered. The house is quieter now, not because it is empty, but because it is full of things that no longer need to be said. The scrolls are rolled, the hearth is swept, the wind outside has settled into a soft hum, like a breath held in the pause before dreaming. You lie back against the old wooden beam, eyes half-lidded, while the scent of sweet rice flour lingers in the air like the final line of a lullaby. And yet, something tugs at your thoughts. Because after everything, after the rolls, the scrolls, the sleepy revolutions, you begin to wonder, was any of it real? Not the bread, of course. That was very real. People ate it, slept better because of it, argued less during like city council meetings, fell in love again over toasted barley buns. No, the bread happened. But the man? Takeda Mitsunari. That's where things get doughy. You see, there's no official record of a samurai named Takeda who both served in the Shimabara Rebellion and ran a back alley bakery in Edo. No government logs, no family registry, just a scattering of diary entries, contradictory letters, and one very strange mural on the back wall of a now defunct tofu shop depicting a warrior calmly feeding a sourdough starter. Some say he's an invention, an allegory whispered from baker to baker, shared like a secret recipe, a lesson in humility, in quiet rebellion, a way of saying, yes, even those trained to kill can learn to fold dough with tenderness. Others believe he was real, but hidden, a man who lived between identities, who turned down formal recognition because what he made wasn't for the archives. It was for the person awake at 3 a.m., the one staring at the ceiling, the one who needed something warm and quiet to believe in. There's even a fringe theory that Takeda wasn't a person at all, but a name passed from one baker to the next, a title like sensei or steward of the oven, the idea being that anyone who practiced with enough care and enough silence could become him. That, in fact, the bakery under the veranda was staffed by many Takeda Mitsunaris across time. Historians still argue about this, of course. One scholar insists Takeda was actually a woman disguised as a man, using baking as cover for a poetic espionage ring. Another proposes that he was just an extremely sleep-deprived monk with a yeast allergy and a knack for shaping dinner rolls into parables. Yet all of them, despite their footnotes and charts and disagreements, end their papers the same way, with a quiet line, whoever he was, the bread was warm. And that's what survives. Not his name, not his robe, but the idea that warmth could be an art form, that someone could move through life with gentleness sharp enough to shape flour into peace. You think back to the people who spoke of him, the widow with the note tucked into her tea cabinet, "Let bread carry the part of me that still worries," the boy who fell asleep mid-bite and woke up whispering the word enough, even Kenji, the grumpy official, who once confessed in a letter that Takwada's soft decision role stopped him from filing a deeply regrettable noise ordinance. Real or not, he left something behind. And that's where Iko's story resumes, because while the original scrolls are fragile, kept in cedar boxes behind the hearth, she's begun making copies, but not perfect ones. No, Aiko rewrites each scroll by hand, adding little drawings in the margins, a sleeping cat, a loaf doing a cartwheel, a tiny sword crying next to a steaming bun. She calls it emotional annotation, and every spring she hosts a strange little festival. People gather at dawn. They leave their shoes outside the garden wall. They sit on cushions in the alley. No speeches, no music, just tea and bread and quiet. Some say it feels like a ceremony. Others say it feels like a nap you never realized you needed. At the end, Aiko reads aloud one scroll. Sometimes it's a recipe. Sometimes it's a poem. Once it was a list of things that don't rise, including doubt, stone, and impatience. But always she ends with the same line. This was his oven, but the warmth is yours. And people cry, of course, and eat, and leave carrying loaves wrapped in paper, marked only with single words like pause, listen, or you're already home. The legend continues, not because it insists on itself, but because it makes room for others. For your tiredness, your quiet, your breath. Takeda, whether man or metaphor, built something more enduring than a bakery. He built a reason to sit still, and if you listen, really listen, you can still hear him, kneading in the next room. The last light of the day has gone, replaced by the soft hum of lantern glow and the faraway rustle of bamboo leaves brushing against each other like slow applause. The oven has been banked for the night, its fire now a low, satisfied purr. The house exhales warmth with each quiet creak of the floorboards. You lie still on the tatami, your limbs heavy, your breath slow, as Takeda moves silently through the room one final time. He checks the cooling loaves, runs his hand gently along the edge of the work table, straightens a crooked scroll, not because it matters, but because it feels right. The final bun of the night sits alone on a woven mat near the hearth. It's small, round, dusted with kinako powder, and perfectly plain. No glaze, no surprise filling, no name. But if it had one, you think it would be called enough. Takeda doesn't look at you. He doesn't have to. He simply nods, as though acknowledging a shared understanding between you, that this was never about the crust or the starter or the trials. It was about permission. Permission to be soft in a world built on edge. Permission to fail a batch and try again. Permission to make something warm and give it away. As he slips behind the bamboo curtain, you hear the faint rattle of bowls being washed. Somewhere in the walls, the wind chime knocks once, and you wonder, not for the first time, if perhaps Takeda was never meant to be remembered for who he was, only for how he made people feel. In the morning, this house will look ordinary again. The oven will cool, the scrolls will remain tucked away, and the alley will fill with footsteps and errands and everything that keeps a city busy. But tonight, there's just this. One room, one quiet oven, one final loaf, and you, held gently in the lull between crust and story. The warmth of the oven lingers, now fading to a soft hush, like the last breath of a lullaby. The scrolls are rolled and tucked away. The flour has settled. The room rests in that perfect stillness that comes after everything has been said, but before the world begins again. You remain still, the tatami beneath you warmed by long ago sunlight, your breath slow, your body heavy in the best possible way. The stories of roles, of starters, of quiet rebellions have folded around you like the soft crust of a well-needed dream. If your thoughts drift, let them. There's no need to follow. Just let them curl up in the corner like a sleepy cat beside the hearth. The only thing that matters now is warmth, and ease, and rest. The kind of rest that doesn't ask for anything in return. The kind that holds you without gripping. That hums quietly, like a kettle just shy of boiling. Let your mind wander if it needs to. Let it remember a scent. Cinnamon, perhaps, or the sound of soft bread breaking, or the feeling of knowing you have, at last, nothing you must do. This story is yours now. The warmth is yours. Let it carry you gently into sleep. Let it rise. Let it rest. Let it be.